traffics, pollutions, high temperature are the things I face every day, everywhere, and keep getting worse. Fossil fuels still dominates the energy sources in the world. I dare to hope that everyone to fight our circumstances, and of course, towards cleaner energy sources. It is possible with our efforts, our collective efforts. Our young generations will be the future decision makers. It is our priorities and responsibilities to develop their skills through several activities in contributing towards energy transitions and climate change. It's our turn. Let's take action.
Indonesia, with its diverse culture and natural resources, has made this country able to stand on its own feet. Even though still struggling, its rich nature gives the energy to stand strong again. The power of energy in Indonesia is spread in all corners of the country, starting from oil and gas, coal mineral, electricity, renewable energy to geology. After 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic in Indonesia, a feeling of despair can truly be felt, but everything must go back to normal. Energy retainers continue to be committed to meeting domestic energy needs amid the pandemic. Investment of $282 billion or 107% from 2020. Non-tax revenue reached 189.2 trillion rupiah, or about 156% from the target of 121.2 trillion rupiah. Energy subsidy amounting 131.5 trillion rupiah consists of subsidies for fuel and LPG of 83.7 trillion rupiah and electricity of 47.8 trillion rupiah. The transfer management of the Rokan block, the largest oil block in Indonesia, from PT Chevron Pacific Indonesia to Pertamina. Ease of investment and incentives to encourage the achievement of the oil production target of 1 million barrels of oil per day and 12 billion standard cubic feet per day of natural gas by 2030. The gas utilization for domestic use in 2021 is 66% higher than the portion for export. 799,000 households are connected to the city gas network. 331 locations for one price of Indonesian fuel. 98.24% coal production from the target of 625 million tons. The realization of mineral refining facilities amounting to 21 smelters. Reclamation of ex-mining land reaches 8,539 hectares from the target of 7,025 hectares. The development of the volcano monitoring system in 4 locations. The implementation of geological mapping of volcanoes in 5 locations. Mapping the earthquake-prone disaster areas in one map. Mapping the ground movement vulnerability zones for 5 locations. The installation of a landslide early warning system in 3 locations. Installed power plant capacity of 74 gigawatt. Installed capacity of 11.152 megawatt new renewable energy power plant. Realization of the new renewable energy mix of 13.5%, an increase from the target of 12.9%. 99.62% electrification ratio for villages. Utilization of domestic biodiesel of 9.3 million kiloliter with foreign exchange savings of 66.54 trillion rupiah. Lowering carbon dioxide emissions by 69.5 million tons. 267 General Electric Vehicle charging stations in 224 locations. 266 units General Electric Vehicle battery exchange stations in 265 locations. The conversion of 100 fuel motorcycles to electric motorcycle conversions.
Di Indonesia sendiri sebetulnya kita memiliki kekuatan yang sangat besar mengenai renewable energy ini. 418 gigawatt, baik itu dari hydropower, geothermal, bio, solar panel, biofuel, arus bawah laut, dan yang lain-lainnya. Potensinya sangat besar sekali.
Currently, the government is committed to reaching the fulfillment of net zero emissions or NZE by 2060 or sooner. Therefore, innovative collaborations must be strengthened to achieve the target. It has great potential, making energy a subject that must be managed carefully to fulfill the needs of the nation. The Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources is here to ensure that energy management in Indonesia is available, affordable, sustainable, and beneficial for the prosperity of the Indonesian people.
Honorable Mr. Prahoro Yulianto Nur Cahyo, Head of Human Resource Development Agency of Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, as the co-chair of Energy Transitions Working Group Indonesia. Honorable Mr. Dadan Kusdiana, Director General of New Renewable Energy and Energy Conservation. Ms. Federica Fricano, Director European Affairs and International Climate Action Italy G20 Troika. Mr. Alain de Serres, Acting Environment Director of OECD, representatives of G20 member countries, invited international organizations, related ministries, embassy of friends countries in Indonesia, academics, and related stakeholders. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon from Jakarta. Welcome to the G20 webinar series, Energy and Climate Financing. I am Alfie, and it is a pleasure for me to be the MC for today's webinar. Today's event shows us the amazing of the digital era, as we have almost everyone with time difference. We may meet virtually, but I'm sure that we share the same spirit. So once again, thank you for joining us today. The Director General of New Renewable Energy and Energy Conservation, Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, together with Ministry of Environment and Forestry, warmly welcome everyone joining us today at the webinar series that will take us all to discuss about the energy and climate financing. Aside from energy access and technology, financing is another priority under the pillar of sustainable energy transitions. Financing holds an important role for increasing and accelerating the energy transitions. So it's been an honor as well to have the keynote speakers, moderators, and panelists that will share their views, experience, insight, as well as strategies in improving energy and climate financing. Without further ado, let's start our today's webinar. First, I would like to kindly invite the co-chair of G20 Energy Transition Working Group to deliver the opening remarks. To Mr. Prahoro Yulianto Nur Cahyo, the screen is yours.
Distinguished speakers and participants, greetings to you all. Good afternoon from Jakarta. I, Prahara Nur Cahyo, co-chair of Energy Transition Working Group, is pleased to welcome you all at the 13th webinar of the ETWG webinar series on energy and climate financings. For a brief background, G20 Indonesian presidency has chosen the main theme, Recover Together, Recover Stronger. The presidency has set 3 pillars, namely global health architecture, digital economic transformation, and sustainable energy transitions. The pillar of sustainable energy transitions is held by Energy Transition Working Group, addressing 3 priorities on accessibility, technology, and financings. We have done the ETWG, the first one in Yogyakarta from the 24th to 25th of March, and the second ETWG in Labuan Bajo from 23rd to 25th of June. Overall, G20 members and invited countries welcomed and supported the priorities and the main agenda toward G20 Energy Transition Ministerial Meeting and G20 Leaders Summit. In specific, I am pleased to inform you all that ETWG, the second one, has invited representatives from the Paris-aligned financing platform from several global initiatives, while delegates also stressed the importance of climate financing in accelerating clean energy transitions. In one of our key deliverables, Bali Compact stands for Common Principles and Accelerating Energy Transitions, also emphasize financings and investment for climate mitigation actions on energy transitions. Our G20 energy transitions agenda is highly urgent and critical. It is time for us, as the major energy producers and consumers, to step up our cooperation and collaborations. We need your contributions on securing just, affordable, and sustainable transitions. Between the ETWG meetings, we are advancing energy transition discussion through webinar series. Today's webinar on energy and climate financings will continue our discussion throughout the presidency's year. To the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, I would like to convey our presidency's highest appreciation for taking the strategic role as co-organizer of today's webinar, as well as coordinating the actions roadmap in the energy transition's finance priority. OECD, with relevant international organizations, is working to prepare the roadmap for financing's priority issues to prepare the pathways toward net zero emissions during this decade of actions. To the Ministry of Environment and Forestry as the coordinator for Environmental Deputy Ministers and Climate Sustainable Working Group, EDMC-SWG, we would like to express our highest compliments for the valuable contributions and cooperations in this webinar, as well as in participation throughout G20 presidencies. So, why is advancing energy and climate financing essential and pivotal for us as G20 Forum? First, Glasgow Climate Pact of COP26 has strengthened the Paris-aligned goals on financings. The landmark Climate Pact reiterates that commitment for global financial flows of $100 billion per year from developed countries to developing countries for whole mitigation and adaptation actions. The Climate Pact advanced the climate financing mechanisms by settling the financing complexity from the Paris Agreement Article 6 into both market mechanisms and non-market mechanisms. Second, the global financing commitment post-COP26 must be followed up by massive financial resources in the decade of actions. IRENA suggests that international communities need investment of $5.7 trillion annually until 2030 to stay on track with 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario. For emerging markets and developing economies, EMDEs, IEA forecasts that clean energy investment in EMDs will have to grow from $150 billion in 2020 to over $1.5 trillion per annum by the end of this decade. Besides the mitigation side on energy transitions, the Global Commission on Adaptation reveals that global communities will require investment amounting to $1.8 trillion globally in 5 adaptation areas during the decade of actions, which may generate $7.1 trillion in total net benefits. Third, in this decade of actions, we need to sharpen our list of actions. We must advance best practices and exchange lessons in designing and implementing innovative financing facilities, including blended finance. We need to deploy platforms that are effective and well-proven in capitalizing limited financial resources for driving commercials and non-commercial financings, while at the same time securing investment for mitigation and adaptation actions. Those deployments should be supported by international and domestic capital market flows and multilateral development banks' contributions. Finally, to the OECD, all speakers from multi-level entities, all delegates from G20 members and invited countries, and all stakeholders, I wish you all a successful webinar in advancing energy and climate financings in G20 and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prahoro, for your very remarkable opening remarks that emphasizing the importance of finance for energy transitions. And next, I would like to invite Ms. Federica Fricano, Director, European Affairs and International Climate Action, Italy, G20 Troika, to deliver the remarks. But before delivering the remarks, I would like to read about her short biography. She is a geologist, and during the G20 Italian presidency in 2021, she was the chair of the Climate Change Sustainability Working Group, who leads the adoption of the G20 Energy and Climate Communique. In 2021, she also coordinated and led the organization of the Youth Climate Event and the pre-COP26 meeting. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please welcome Ms. Federica Fricano.
Good afternoon and good evening, colleague. Let me first of all thank you, our G20 presidency, for inviting me to this seminar and welcome this event, which is dedicated to the energy and climate finance in the context of the G20 discussion. I also take this opportunity to thank the OECD for taking the lead in bringing us together to exchange our views on this key topic of financing clean energy and climate action. As you know, the international community is currently, and I would say also increasingly, pushed to concretely lead the way to effective approach to financing the fight to climate change and commiserate to the challenge that we have ahead. And finding appropriate instrument and partnership to fund a transformative pathway at sectorial and aggregated level. Even though global climate finance flow increased significantly over the last decade, we all know that significant gaps still remain. And in this space, the G20 country can play a role, and also an important role, in funding way and means to pursue the collective efforts of mobilizing resources for climate action, energy transition, and as well sustainable development. Italy is working under the UNFCCC on the process leading to the setting of the new collective quantified goal on climate finance in 2024. As you may know, we are proud co-chair the work stream, which will shape climate finance commitment for the next decade. In this context, the need to work together with the private sector, finding a way in which its contribution can be valued and create incentive for the private sector to allocate investment to most impactful and priority areas has emerged strongly. We need innovative solutions and approaches. These elements also has emerged from the study promoted by the Indonesian presidency. It's therefore of pivotal importance that all G20 countries invest time and resources to promote their implementation and steer further solution according to the needs, especially when, of course, it comes to sectorial solution, for example, like the clean energy financing. That's why we are largely support a practical approach backed by robust strategic thinking by the G20 countries on tackling the well-known issues as the lack of mobilization of private sector we were talking about, especially for climate change adaptation. To that end, the work undertaken by the G20 presidency on a shared roadmap can be precious, can be important, since it will highlight priorities and critical area for climate and clean energy financing. That will be important both for the public and the private sector for increasing synergies and complementarity in the provision of mobilization of resources, and also for identifying bottleneck and key issue where an important and decisive acceleration is needed. Investment in adaptation and resilience directly need interest by the private sector. In this context, public policy and support can unlock significant resources, especially in developing countries. To steer investment in adaptation, the partnership approach can yield high gains if designed in a way that brings together the whole range of interested actors, leverage on each one comparative advantage and expertise. Clean energy transition that we also are going to discuss today is also one of these critical areas where investments are stable or declining with respect to the past, and where the public together with the private sector investment are still inadequate with respect to the potential of the sector and the resources that are needed. This discussion and its outcome should help us in progressing towards the identification of low-hanging fruits on critical areas where the G20 can be game changer. So we thank you very much for organizing this event, and we wish all of you a good work. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Federica, for your remarks in emphasizing how a collaboration, including with private sector, is important in developing finance for energy transitions. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite Mr. Alain de Serres, Acting Environment Director, OECD, to deliver the remarks. To Mr. Alain de Serres, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Dear Pak Prahoro, Ibu Laxmi, Pak Luki, Pak Dadan, Mrs. Fricano, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be with you today and to add my welcome to the speakers and participants to this important session on energy and climate finance. It is fitting to hold this final session on finance just before the finance ministers meeting later this week in Bali. The OECD is honored to be among the international organizations supporting the Indonesian G20 presidency, and we are involved in various working groups under both the Sherpa and finance tracks. I would like to thank the Indonesian G20 Energy Transition Team for their fruitful collaboration with the OECD's Clean Energy Finance and Investment Mobilization Team on the finance priority. This includes co-organizing today's event, as well as inputs to the stocktake and the roadmap. OECD countries have committed to intensifying their work on climate, to align finance with environmental objectives and accelerate climate change action, with a view to keep the 1.5 degree Celsius temperature limit, increased limit within reach. Mobilizing access to finance for emerging and developing economies will be an important part of reaching that goal. It is indeed critical that we reach the $100 billion goal of climate finance provided and mobilized for developing countries as quickly as possible. Transitioning the energy sector away from fossil fuels toward clean energy sources will be crucial for achieving the net zero transition. At the same time, it will also contribute to support a sustainable economic recovery. While we know that the climate finance challenge is considerable, especially in emerging and developing economies, as we will hear later from our speakers, the good news is that the financial sector actors are increasingly recognizing climate change and the sustainable development goals in investment decisions. These investors are looking for dynamic new markets and investment opportunities in sustainable infrastructure, and we believe that clean energy projects match well their long-term investment needs. This is what the OECD has witnessed working alongside institutional investors for years. So we stand ready to continue supporting Indonesia's G20 presidency, and we look forward to continuing to support your country's energy transition under our SIFIM country program for Indonesia. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to our discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alain Deseres, for supporting Indonesia in accelerating energy transitions. And now, ladies and gentlemen, let's move on to the next agenda. I would like to kindly invite Honorable Director General of New Renewable Energy and Energy Conservation to deliver the keynote speech. Please welcome Mr. Dadan Kusdiana.
Good afternoon from Jakarta, Honorable my colleague Mr. Yudo Priyadi, Chair of Energy Transition Working Group Indonesia, Mr. Nicola Bazzani, Troika G20 from Italy, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to extend my gratitude and appreciation to OECD for the cooperation in conducting this workshop as part of G20 webinar series. Under the theme of energy and climate financing, this webinar aims to share best practices in the design of innovative financing solutions and how to maximize climate finance commitment to mitigate financing disparities. Distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, the speed of energy transition differs between one country to another. Some countries experience energy transition as the stimulation of sustainable economic growth, while other countries, including Indonesia, need breakthrough in policies, technology partnership, including financial support, in addressing socio-economic impacts to enable faster pace of energy transition. Formulating the right strategy, policy, and regulation for energy transition is very crucial and create a strong energy security. In terms of us, Indonesia, a roadmap toward net zero emission has been developed, including a scenario of coal-fired power plant gradual retirement. There will be no plan to add the power plant except those already in our RUPTL, the general planning for procurement of electricity, while the last coal-fired power plant will be retired by 2056. A greener RUPTL 2021 to 2030 has also been issued to achieve NDC and net zero emission target by allocating almost 52% share of renewables to be developed, or these are equal to 20.9 gigawatt additional capacity. After 2030, electricity supply will only come from new and renewable energy power plants, such as solar, followed by wind and ocean energy. Hydrogen and nuclear will be also utilized in 2031, starting from 2031 and 2049. Renewable energy development as one of the strategies to achieve energy transition will create a huge amount of investment, resulting in the improvement of economic development towards green economy. In accordance with our simulation toward Indonesia net zero emission 2060, the total required investment, particularly for power plant development, is $1,177 billion or equivalent with 29 billion per year, consisting of power generation of $1,042 billion and the transmission system for $135 billion. Comprehensive policy reforms are also carried out to support the implementation of these strategies. It is expected to achieve budget savings, reduce poverty and inequality, gender and social inclusion, increase the use of clean energy alternatives, and eventually achieve energy transition. So shifting on technologies, job, skills, capacities, and expertise are also needed. This must be developed and equally distributed to support transformational processes, particularly in emerging countries like us here, Indonesia. The development of technology will reduce emission growth in the coming decades. However, only 50% of technology is available to support energy transition, while the remaining, such as hydrogen-based energy, advanced batteries, small modular reactor, and other are still under development. Scaling up finance should be mobilized to encourage climate mitigation and adaptation of all sectors, including energy, which contributes around 3/4 of global greenhouse gas emission. IEA also reported that clean energy investment in emerging and developing economies needed to grow from 150 billion in 2020 to over $1 trillion per year by the end of the decade to keep the world on track to a 1.5-degree pathway. Most importantly, in terms of finance, advanced economies must contribute to mobilize public and private finance for emerging economies and developing countries. IRENA is estimated to reach net zero emission by 2050. Globally, we need to triple annual investment to $4.4 trillion to deploy clean energy. We also need to firm up and collect commitment from developed countries to share up to $100 billion per year funding to deal with climate change. So in closing, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, through these excellent sessions, we strongly emphasize the support needed from developed countries in the field of clean energy technologies with competitive costs in aiding emerging economies and developing countries. We also emphasize the availability of special funding which can be accessed by all parties with attractive and affordable mechanisms. These are inevitable for enabling immediate actions now toward net zero emission. This webinar is expected to achieve consensus in mobilizing additional source of capital to accelerate cleaner energy transition and private capital for the development of finance, action plan, and the roadmap. Thank you, and may we all have a good day.
Yes, thank you very much for your valuable speech, Mr. Dadan Kusdiana. And ladies and gentlemen, before we proceed to the next agenda, we will have screen setting presentation that will be delivered by Mr. Alain Deseres and Mr. Tim Gold. The allotted time for the presentation will be for 5 minutes each. So, but before call upon Mr. Alain Deseres, I would like to read the short biography. Alain Deseres is currently Acting Director of the OECD Environment Directorate, overseeing the implementation of directorate programs on environmental issues including green growth, climate change, biodiversity, quality of ecosystem, eco-innovation, circular economy, and resource productivity. Before that, he was a Deputy Director in the Policy Studies branch of the OECD Economics Department. So, please welcome Mr. Alain Deseres.
Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon again to everyone. In my remarks, which will be supported by a few slides, I just want to provide some highlights from ongoing work on climate finance, and that particularly aspects that are relevant for energy. So once the slides are up, if you could move to the next slide, please. Okay, let me start by saying that since 2015, the OECD has been tracking progress towards developed countries' commitment to mobilize the $100 billion for climate action in developing countries. Now, our most up-to-date figures on this for 2020 will be released next week, so they are still being finalized. Just as a reminder, in 2019, climate finance provided and mobilized by developed countries summed up to about $80 billion, This was up 2% from 2018, so quite some bigger increases are needed to close the gap, which is now about 20 billion. We're about 20 billion short of meeting the 2020 goal of mobilizing 100 billion. Of the total climate finance provided and mobilized for the energy sector, renewable energy has the lion's share. And within that, solar energy, of course, is key. And renewables are also accounting for most of the finance mobilized from the private sector. So it's both public and private sectors. If you can move to the next slide, please. Now, one important objective behind the quest for sources of finance is the need to boost resilience. And dedicated climate finance for adaptation is essential, but we also need to ensure that all finance flows are contributing to resilience, including the trillions of dollars that are being spent on new infrastructure every year. Article 2.1 of the Paris Agreement calls on countries to align finance flows with climate resilient development, but so far the focus has almost been exclusively on mitigation. So at the OECD, we are undertaking work to support alignment by helping to define, to track, and mobilize finance for specifically climate resilience. And our new report, Framing Paper on Climate Resilience, Finance and Investment, proposes a definition of climate resilience aligned with finance, and which encompasses two main items. One is identification and management of physical climate risk, and the second is ensuring that, at the minimum, the investment does not undermine the resilience of others, and in fact aims to have positive spillovers. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, the clean energy sector receives the largest share of climate finance, but much of this development finance needs to be used better. Blended finance, the use of development finance to crowd in commercial or other investment will be critical to closing the finance gap. And it can have a number of benefits over traditional development assistance. For instance, the same amount of public resource can have a larger development impact if it successfully mobilizes commercial finance. Involvement of the private sector can bring much needed expertise, leading to replication and scale. It can increase domestic participation and improve perceptions of investment risk in emerging and developing economies. So the OECD is developing guidance to help policymakers, donors, and the private sector to better assess the conditions for blended finance in clean energy. This means looking at the underlying barriers to investment across various clean energy subsectors and drawing lessons on which financing approaches can most efficiently and effectively address those barriers, as some of these are illustrated on this slide. Now, blended finance should not be considered as a panacea and will need to be supported by efforts to improve domestic regulation and policy environments for clean energy. There needs to be a good environment conducive to investment. Next slide, please. Now, when we speak about clean energy investment, we also need to be very clear about the dissuasive impact of the billions of money that governments continue to spend on fossil fuel subsidies. Latest OECD estimates show spending at 190 billion in 2021, up from 147 billion in 2020, just as energy prices rose with the rebound in the global economy. So the trend is not great in that respect. Some of these reflects measures that focus on capping prices. And our assessment is that targeting income support to households and businesses most in need can help maintain incentive to reduce fossil-based energy and encourage a transition to carbon neutrality. It would also reduce the impacts on the public purse. Next slide, please. Just one final point. Closing the climate finance gap will require more than just money. It will require key stakeholders to work much more effectively together. Governments need to lead on the development of strategies that have a just transition at their core to minimize distributional and social impacts. while realizing the potential to rebalance economies in a fairer and more sustainable direction. So this requires efforts to deepen local capital markets so that citizens and local businesses can contribute and benefit from the transition. Governments and donors also need to more routinely bring in the private sector, not just when they are looking for finance, but much earlier on in the process through consultations on policy and sector pathways. Country platforms and investor dialogues can be a good way to bring all these actors together to achieve concrete action. The Just Energy Transition Partnership being developed for certain countries is one example of a new partnership model. And finally, we also need to support countries to develop bankable projects and to use public finance to de-risk investment, tipping the risk return profile in favor of private investment. And on this, thank you for your patience and attentions.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Alain Deseros, for your presentation. And for the next presentation will be delivered by Mr. Tim Gold. But before, here is the short biography of the Mr. Tim Gold. He was appointed as the agency's chief energy economist in 2021, who provides strategic advice on energy economic across a wide range of IEA activities and analysis. Mr. Gold is also head of the Division for Energy Supply and Investment Outlooks. He also co-leads the World Energy Outlook, the IEA's flagship publication, and oversees the agency's work on investment and finance, including the World Energy Investment Report. So without further ado, please welcome Mr. Tim Gold.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to contribute to this event today. Gratitude to our OECD colleagues, but also to our Indonesian hosts, with whom we're working very closely on a range of issues across the G20 agenda, including our net zero roadmap work with Pak Dadan and his team. In these brief remarks, I would like to go through some recent work that we've done looking not at energy flows, but at capital flows. How much money is coming into the global energy sector? Where is it going? And what does that tell us about the state of energy and climate financing and the risks and opportunities that might lie ahead? And to begin with, I'd like to look at the whole spectrum of energy investment spending. You can see that that went down in 2020, but we did have a rebound in 2021, and we anticipate another 8% increase in 2022. But one caveat, one warning is that almost half of that increase in 2022 is linked to higher costs. And that's something that we see in the oil and gas space. But it's unfortunately something that we see rising cost pressures also in some clean energy value chain. If we just isolate this spending that is related to energy transitions, and you can see the categories on the right-hand side of the screen, for the 5 years after the conclusion of the Paris Agreement, that picture was relatively static. But since 2020, we have had a significant increase in spending on clean energy transitions. And that's good news for our climate ambitions. And there are some signs of life also in some categories that you can't see on the screen there. They're relatively small, but they are growing quite quickly. And I would highlight in particular areas like battery energy storage, which we anticipate to double this year, investment spending, carbon capture utilization and storage, where there is a lot of new announcements and projects underway, and also low emissions hydrogen, which has been given a big boost also by Europe's efforts to diversify away from Russian gas. And this is very much in line with what Pak Prahori and Pak Dadan said in their introductory remarks. There is this still a large gap between the trends in advanced economies and in China on the one hand, and in many other emerging and developing economies. We are concerned that we are not seeing the pickup in clean energy spend that we would need to see in order to meet rising demand for energy services in developing economies in a sustainable way. And that really underlines the importance of this discussion about climate finance and also the measures that can be taken by governments to unlock flows of capital to new clean energy projects. I would like to highlight one aspect of the financing side, which I think is particularly significant, and that is the explosion that we've seen in recent years in the issuance of sustainable debt. And that's what you're looking at on the left-hand side of the screen here. But it is not well correlated with the money that is going into clean energy investment projects. And there is also this regional mismatch between the availability or the issuance of sustainable debt, which is concentrated largely in advanced economies, and the needs of many clean energy transitions in the rest of the world. So I think it's very important to find ways to build bridges between that sustainable finance movement and the needs that we see for clean energy spending elsewhere. One other aspect of this that I would like to highlight very strongly is the investment that is needed in various clean energy supply chains. And the reason why, or one of the reasons why, we have seen an increase in costs for some key clean energy technologies in the last couple of years is because some very important inputs to those technologies have risen in price. And you can see on the screen the silicon in the case of solar PV. You can see lithium in the case of lithium-ion batteries, and steel for wind turbines. So we need also investment to diversify and make more resilient those clean energy value chains if we are to support the rise in deployment that we know is necessary. Finally, a few words on what does our snapshot of clean energy spending mean for the energy crisis that we are in at the moment, but also the climate crisis that we are so aware of. And here you have on the left-hand side of the screen the amount of money that is going into clean energy and infrastructure. And that's benchmarked against the amounts that we think will be needed by 2030 on an annual basis in order to meet those climate pledges that governments have made. And then an even greater rise if we are to get on track for a 1.5 degree stabilization in global average temperature. And there is a lot of focus on what needs to happen in the fossil fuel space. But there we have seen already quite a significant reduction in the amount of capital going to fossil fuels since 2015. And the amount that is being spent at the moment is broadly aligned with what would be required in a world that hits its climate pledges. But remember, that world also requires that we spend a lot more on curbing fossil fuel demand through investment in clean energy and infrastructure. So I think the key message that I would like to leave you with today is that if we just look at the flows of capital into the energy sector today, something has to change. We are not spending enough on energy. In our view, the thing that has to change is on the left-hand side of the screen. The way out of our current crisis, the lasting solution to the difficulties that we face in today's energy sector is to scale up our investment in clean energy and clean energy infrastructure. And that's the thought I would like to leave you with today, with many, many thanks for the invitation to contribute to this event.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tim Gold, for your very comprehensive presentation. And distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, now let's move on to our next agenda of panel discussion. It is divided into two panel discussions led by a moderator. And for the first panel discussion entitled Closing the Global Climate Finance Gap, please allow me to invite Ms. Cecilia Tam to be the moderator. Before taking the lead, let me read her short biography. Cecilia Tam leads the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or known as OECD, on Clean Energy Finance and Investment Mobilization Program. Prior to taking up this role, she held a number of leadership positions at the International Energy Agency. Cecilia is an expert in clean energy finance, energy technology deployment, and innovation. Ms. Cecilia, are you ready to lead the panel?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, so before that, you have 60 minutes for the panel, and I will let you know if the time is up. So please, you may lead the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to moderate our first session today and welcome our 5 distinguished speakers who bring a wealth of experience developing and financing adaptation and clean energy projects, as well as designing and implementing financing solutions to close the global climate finance gap. This session will focus on how limited public finance can be used to mobilize much larger amounts of private capital for climate action. For this panel, we have asked each speaker to provide brief introductory remarks highlighting your organization's experience in supporting private capital mobilization for adaptation and clean energy investments. I ask that all speakers limit these first remarks to no more than 5 minutes so that we may have time for a round of questions afterwards. Our first speaker will be Pak Luki Alferman, Director General of Budget Financing and Risk Management, Ministry of Finance, Indonesia. He is responsible primarily for managing public debt, including government securities and loan and government risks, as well as fiscal support for public-private partnership projects. Pak Luki, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Cecile. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Very good afternoon from Bali. I'm actually in Bali. Very good afternoon, very good evening, very good morning for all of you. As a country that is prone to the impact of climate change, Indonesia has ratified the Paris Agreement in 2016 and submitted our commitment of NDC to address this climate change. So our target is to reduce greenhouse gas emission with a decrease of 29% with our own capabilities and 41% with international support by 2030. And as Padana mentioned early on, Indonesia also has progressed even further by pledging commitment to achieve net zero emission by 2060 or earlier. For Indonesia, the main priority to decrease greenhouse gas emission is in the forestry sector, as well as energy and transportation sectors that already covering 97% of the total target of Indonesia NDC emission. However, to achieve this NDC commitment, as well as energy transition, climate change adaptation and mitigation effort need large funding, with the estimated mitigation cost is around $263 billion according to NDC mitigation roadmap of Indonesia up to 2030. So to achieve this target, government of Indonesia has some initiatives underway. 4 key initiatives are: number 1, energy transition mechanism. This ETM initiative is now being designed with multilateral development banks, which includes retirement of coal-fired power plants and encouraging more new renewable energy power plants. This initiative certainly needs sufficient financing and support from various sources, including private investors. So I encourage all of you to follow and join discussion on ETM, this specific issue on ETM that will be held tomorrow under Sustainable Finance for Climate Action Roundtable in G20, where we will be launching Indonesia ETM country platform. I believe this is a very good opportunity to promote, emphasize private financing, the role of different financial institutions, including energy sector in the transition. Number 2, the government of Indonesia continues promoting creative financing through For example, like PPP scheme, public-private partnership for green project to increase economic value and reduce the risk of the project with some government support, such as project development facility, credit enhancement facility, vulnerability gap fund, government guarantee. In the front, on the blended finance front, uh, Government of Indonesia has developed what's so-called the SDG Indonesia One as a blended finance platform managed by PTSMI to mobilizing funds for climate action from philanthropists, donors, climate funds, green investors, MDBs, international institutions, commercial banks, sovereign wealth funds, and other institutional investors. Other examples are geothermal fund facility to accelerate geothermal development with its de-risking feature, and a funding platform managed by Environmental Fund Management Agency or BPDLH to mobilize public and private funds to support environmental protection programs. Another example is Green Bond and Green Sukuk framework that was launched in 2018 that later expanded into SDG government securities framework. With this framework, it was soon followed by the issuance of our global green sukuk every year that so far we have mobilized 5 billion US dollar from 5 issuances, plus 3 domestic retail green sukuk in 2018 and 2022 to finance eligible green projects. During 2018-2020, the financing from green sukuk is estimated able to reduce 10.3 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions, which is allocated for 5 eligible green sectors: renewable energy, energy efficiency, improving climate resilience for vulnerable areas, sustainable transportation, and waste management and waste to energy. In 2021, with the new SDG framework, the Republic of Indonesia successfully issued the first 12 years SDG bond in the amount of 500 million euro to finance environmental and social projects. Number 3, carbon pricing and carbon tax. Basically, currently ongoing policy that is still work in progress is the development of carbon market with various instruments such as carbon trade and carbon pricing mechanism and carbon tax. Technical regulation and carbon trade infrastructure are currently being prepared. And other policy to attract private investment and to accelerate this new renewable energy development includes tax incentive, various tax incentive, and we also can share with you that new presidential regulation on the price of electricity for this new and renewable energy is currently being finalized. We also are currently preparing an ESG framework to support the provision of government facilities for infrastructure projects. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, this year, Indonesia is holding the presidency of G20. Sustainability issue, particularly sustainable energy transition, is among the focus agenda of the Indonesia presidency, aligned with Indonesia's strong commitment to promote the sustainability agenda. Furthermore, the issue of sustainability becomes a major theme in most of working group agenda in finance track, such as in the Sustainable Finance Working Group and Infrastructure Working Group. Despite such a high commitment, in practice, we know financing for renewable energy is still quite limited, which is also caused by high perceptions of banks or other financial institutions on the project risk. For Indonesia in particular, non-renewable energy electricity tariff is also not quite competitive yet with fossil-based electricity. So the financing challenge is very crucial because a comprehensive, innovative financing strategy should be formulated with collaboration with all stakeholders. In addition, we would like to share our experience that perhaps can be taken as good lessons for others in issuing thematic bond or sukuk as follow. Thematic bonds needs extra effort for sure, namely framework preparation, framework review from second party opinion, impact report, report assurance audit from external auditors. So, number 2 is also very crucial to choose the right partners which not only have capacity but also reputation to support framework establishment and development issuances, including investor meeting and impact reporting. Third, strong commitment and coordination from all stakeholders are crucial, especially line ministers. Fourth, this is very important, to encourage more parties, both sovereigns and private sectors, to issue green or SDG or ESG instruments. Incentives in terms of pricing benefit, or also known as greenium, are extremely needed. Last but not least, I would like to emphasize that the complex challenge lie ahead for ESG financing requires constant effort from all. Achieving sustainable development goals certainly requires strong collaboration from governments, businesses, multilateral agencies, NGOs, and communities. Thank you, and back to you, Cecilia.
Thank you very much, Pak Luki, for sharing with us Indonesia's perspective on climate financing and for some of the recent sustainable financing initiatives. I'd like to now invite our next speaker, Abhishek Bhaskar, who leads the recently launched Climate Investment Fund's Accelerating Coal Transition Investment Program, along with the dedicated CIF Technical Assistance Facility, to share some of CIF's experience mobilizing finance for clean energy projects. Abhishek, please go ahead.
Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you also to the G20 presidency, OECD, for inviting us to contribute. CIF is one of the largest and oldest climate finance delegates, over $10 billion in concessional funding envelope. For over a decade, we have deployed over $7.5 billion in concessional capital that has mobilized over 60 billions in additional financing. And this has come from a range of sources, from private sector, public, MDBs, and so on. We are an MDB partnership, which means we work exclusively with 6 multilateral development banks. These include the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, EBRD, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the World Bank. World Bank Group, including IFC, of course. We co-finance with MDBs some of the strategic priorities in key sectors in both low-income and middle-income countries, which are an outcome of a country-led process. These areas include clean energy, coal transition, resilience, and forestry. What we offer is large-scale concessional, risk-bearing, and predictable capital that lowers risks, it lowers cost of financing, and in the process mobilizes higher volumes of private sector and other sources of financing. So based on this collective experience of many years and deploying a large volume of concessional capital on the ground, we have recently launched and been engaged in a number of initiatives, including the Accelerating Coal Transition Investment Program, the ACT program, a Renewable Energy Integration Program, or REI, and also the more recent and much talked about JET partnership that was launched in South Africa at COP26. So let me highlight a couple of these in the context of this discussion. On the upstream enabling environment side, we have the dedicated technical assistance facility that supports policy reforms and capacity building in 3 key areas of energy sector, financial sector, and a third area called the transaction enablers, which is to support market-facing solutions such as innovative business models, innovative instruments, all with the goal of accelerating clean energy investments. We also issued or launched the Green and Resilient Recovery track that supported countries with relevant reforms coming out of the pandemic. One of the key areas of the TA facility is the financial sector, which is a USP of the facility, where it focuses on making sure that there is close coordination with the financial sector as it pertains to clean energy investments. The second example I want to highlight is the ACT investment program. We recognize the importance of coal to clean energy transition and have been working over the last up close to 2 years now on this dedicated investment program to facilitate such a transition in client countries. As part of a rigorous process, we selected 4 countries to pilot this approach, and we allocated close to $2 billion to tackle key challenges through a three-pillar approach under the program. These three key pillars target, number one, governance, targeting the policy and institutional reforms necessary to put the country on a pathway to coal to clean transition. The second pillar focuses on people, which focuses and targets just transition of people and communities who are affected most by the transition. And the third pillar focuses on infrastructure, which is to do with coal asset decommissioning and repurposing. Indonesia is one of the 4 countries selected for this pilot phase, and the government is working closely with our partner MDBs, including Asian Development Bank and World Bank, to explore opportunities to test new approaches towards decommissioning and repurposing of these coal assets. They will be, along with the other 3 countries, which are in India, South Africa, and the Philippines, developing an investment plan against an indicative allocation of $500 million in concessional financing, which is going to mobilize additional sources of financing, such as private sector, MDBs, and others. And the activities will target both upstream enabling environment activities as well as downstream investment activities. Indonesia has also been selected as part of a group of countries under our Renewable Energy Integration Program that aims to scale up enabling technologies such as green hydrogen, energy storage, smart grids, etc., with the goal of facilitating renewable energy integration into the system. The third example I want to highlight, and this is the last example, is around the recently much discussed country platform. We have been actively engaged as a convener of the Secretariat for the JEC Partnership in South Africa that was announced at COP26, where we are performing a technical coordination role, which means we are working closely with the government of South Africa and the International Partners Group to mobilize action and resources to support South Africa's long-term decarbonization efforts. There are 4 key priority areas under the partnership. One includes electricity decarbonization. The second focuses on utilities creditworthiness, in this case, ESCOM's creditworthiness. The third is to do with this transition of people and communities most affected by the transition. And third is new economic areas such as green hydrogen and electric vehicles. I'd like to close my intervention by emphasizing 5 key lessons that based on this experience of both our decade-long experience in implementing some of these programs, as well as some of these new initiatives that I mentioned just now. And these are as follows. Number one, sector-level prioritization must be an outcome of a country-led, country-owned process, and is critical for the sustainability of outcomes and greater impact. A consultative process that ensures buy-in from key stakeholder groups is crucial for success. Number two, scale of financing needed is going to be significant, as we all know, if we are to meet our climate ambition. And so we must look beyond business as usual. Private sector will be a key source of mobilizing large volumes of financing, and we need to explore beyond project-based approach to more programmatic approaches to match that ambition or solutions to meeting that ambition. Number three, targeted and catalytic use of limited public, particularly concessional sources of financing, is of paramount importance to alleviate risks, to demonstrate proof of concepts, etc. And this is especially true as we move from one crisis to the other, and there is increasing pressure on constrained public finance. The fourth point I want to highlight is that partnerships and coordination among stakeholders, and these stakeholders include donors, DFIs, thought leaders such as OECD and IEA, and private sector are crucial. And this is important not only to ensure complementarity, additionality, but also to avoid duplication that can lead to deeper impact on the ground. The last point I want to make is people-centric or just transition of people and communities should be at the center of all efforts to minimize distributional and social impact, something that our speakers have identified already and have been recognized widely as a key focus area. We at the CIF have a Just Transition initiative that looks at lessons learned from various country-level experiences and contexts, and we have also deliberately used those lessons in informing the mainstreaming of such concepts into our new programs such as ACT and REI that I mentioned already. So with that, let me stop here, but happy to take any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abhishek, for telling us about CIF's programs to support countries in their clean energy transition and for sharing some of the lessons learned and key elements that are necessary for achieving real long-term success. I'd like to now welcome our next speaker, Pat Darwin, Director of Operations and Finance at PTSMI. In the last 5 months, he has successfully raised more than 1.2 billion of funding in order to support company investment and financing, while also managing company investment portfolios. Pat Darwin, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Cecilia. Very good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. PTSMI, as a development financial institution owned by the government of Indonesia, is actually putting our commitment to continue support for the government efforts in tackling this climate change. So also in this energy, our support coming into our business pillar, our 3 business pillars. The first one, and also our main activities, is on the financing and investment, as well as on the advisory and project development. Understanding that the project will require some support to allow them to be more bankable and can access to the financing. The last 2 of our business pillars is actually supporting to those areas. On the financing and investment, PTSMI is work in collaboration with multilateral and bilateral agencies, as well as with the commercial bank, GSO funds, and sovereign wealth fund, as well as with the climate fund, to make the financing for the infrastructures in Indonesia is actually still within their appetite. SMI is among the accredited entity for the Green Climate Fund. We are the first accredited entity in the Southeast Asia for this Green Climate Fund. By having this accreditation, I think SMI can then actually having an access to use the resource that coming from the commitment of the global commitment on the climate financing. In 2018, PTSMI received a mandate from the Minister of Finance to manage the Indonesian first blended finance platform that we call SDG Indonesia Ones. This blended finance platform is actually to support the government initiative on how it can actually fulfill the requirement for the financing of the infrastructures need in Indonesia, especially on the energy sector. Given to the situation in which that not many projects is actually ready for the financing, this blended finance can also support in the areas for the development, to support on the areas of establishment of the project documentations. And by having this, it allow the participation from any agencies, both from the development financing agencies, donor philanthropies, public sectors, and commercial financing to sit within the provided structure that we provide. The structure that include the development facilities, the risking facilities, as well as financing, and also for the equity financing. Up to June 2022, there are already 3.2 billion commitment that we received from our 35 partners. And by this June, we already supported 61 projects, as well as 52 activities to be enabling on the financing for the SDG Indonesia that include the renewable energy sectors. The key intervention under this blended finance is actually coming from through of the developments, meaning that we are channeling the grant funding to the several project developers to allow the project developer to better prepare of their infrastructure project or energy project. In this example, we are providing support to the solar program by certain Indonesian companies that we received from the Climate Foundation. Not only that, we are also try to actually help to build the capacity in achieving financial and economic and social objective of the project in collaboration with several program under the bilateral agencies like USAID and our European Climate Foundation. On the de-risking area, SMI is actually channeling the facility from the Climate Fund to do the reimbursable grant to help in reducing the risk that can be that should be managed by the project developer in the way that they would like to finance the exploration state on the geothermal projects. We are working together with World Bank as well as with the GCF and other climate funds. Other de-risking product that we also implement here in Indonesia is by providing the investment premium that we receive from our partners, which is from the European Union as well as from the AFD, to allow the reducing the cost of capital for expenditure to support the subsidized capital expenditure on the project. On the financing, I think we also channeling several concessional loan to help reduce the cost of fund of the projects by channeling this concessional and blending with other source of funding. And lastly, from me, I think what I can share with you is actually we are about to start with the program on the energy transitions by starting to prepare, not starting, I think we have already prepared some concept or structures for Indonesia energy transition mechanism, in which PTSMI being mandated to become the manager of this country platform for the energy transition mechanism for Indonesia. That probably can blend all those resources required to support this initiative. I think that's the end of my presentation, and happy to take certain questions from the audience. Thank you very much. Back to you, Cecilia.
Thank you very much, Pak Darwin, for sharing with us progress on SDG Indonesia One Fund and highlighting the importance of supporting project development to increase the number of bankable projects, and also for sharing with us different de-risking mechanisms that can help to reduce the cost of project financing. I'd now like to invite our next speaker, Dr. Ajay Mathur, Director General of the International Solar Alliance. He earlier headed the Energy and Resource Institute, TERI, the Indian Bureau of Energy Efficiency, and was responsible for mainstreaming energy efficiency in houses, offices, and industries through a number of innovative initiatives. Dr. Mathur will share with us ICE's activities supporting solar project development and finance. Dr. Mathur, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Sister. It's such a pleasure to be here. I thank the OECD and the Indonesian presidency of G20 for this opportunity. What I'd like to do is to highlight how clean energy is not reaching and how it could reach solar investments in general. As previous speakers have focused on, Mr. Desarias, in gold, etc., it's not as if money is not coming into the renewable energy sector. In the last few years, we have seen that the amount of investment that has occurred globally in the solar area is large. In 2021, for example, about $200 billion worth of investment went into the solar sector. But the problem is, as Tim Gold mentioned, is the geographical skewedness of the investments. We do see a large amount of money flowing into the OECD countries and China, and relatively little flowing into other economies. This is challenging. We therefore decided to speak to a lot of investors to find out why is it that they were investing in OECD and China and not in other geographies. For example, the largest amount of energy growth that is happening, the largest amount of solar energy insolation that is there is in Africa. But Africa invited only 4.7% of the investment, total global solar investment in the year 2021. So why? As we talked to investors, and we talked to 180 of them, there were three key issues that they highlighted. The first was that they weren't sure whether they would get their money back. This, they said, and I'm using words which were used by one of them, that they were looking at OECD level risks for investing capital. They would look at returns which are far in excess of OECD returns before investing in other geographies. The second thing that they said was that the size of projects and the numbers of projects were limited. And consequently, going through the entire process of the transaction costs that were involved in financing one particular project of a few $1 million was not good enough. They were looking at investments in the $20 million range. The third thing that they mentioned was that they did not see that there was an investment policy which therefore attracted investments, that there were a number of projects coming up in the future, that there was a transparent process for awarding of projects. Looking at all of this, we decided that what we needed was, as has been mentioned earlier, I think it was Mr. D. Sellers who mentioned it, a blended finance facility. But the key here is that the blended finance facility has 3 buckets. The largest bucket is a risk mitigation bucket, and that provides resources for the creation of a payment guarantee mechanism or a first loss mechanism, the kinds of things which give investors the confidence of investing in solar in these countries and therefore perceiving risks which are at the level of OECD level risks. The second was to have a pipeline of projects. We needed to invest in capacity building, in so-called readiness, so that there is a pipeline of projects which you can then aggregate. And getting local partners through the blended finance facility that we are creating helps bring in local capital for debt, which I think is the cheapest method, but also enables them to collect projects. And the third bucket is a very small amount of financing. After all, this we are putting our money where our mouth is. But in the process, crowdsourcing, private sector financing into the pot, and therefore creating the kinds of mechanisms that are needed for the financing. We are looking forward. The first blended finance facility that we are creating is for Africa, and the second that we are creating is for Asia, and the third that we will create will be for Latin America. Together, we believe that these facilities would help draw in the investment for large-scale solar development in the countries of the developing world. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mathur, for sharing your insights on the challenges faced in solar investments in developing countries and for outlining the mechanisms that are being designed under ICE's blended finance facility to try and overcome some of these challenges. Last but not least, I'd like to bring in the view of the private sector and welcome Alice Carr, Executive Director of Public Policy at GFANZ, which is working at pace to ensure that the global financial system can deliver on its net zero commitments. Alice will share with us how the network will be working with governments and other stakeholders to turn the billions in public funding into trillions in investments needed to meet the net zero transition. Alice, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Cecilia. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to join this panel. I'm also in Bali, as some of you are. I wanted to focus on 4 things that at GFANZ we're working with our membership of more than 500 financial institutions globally in order to close the climate financing gap. Some of the things I might say might sound a bit obvious to you all, but I'm not sure that we should take for granted that they're completely well understood and front of mind for those that are making the top-down policy. So the first point is just obvious for all of us, but we have to be bound by the global carbon budget in line with 1.5. And I say that because we face clearly a challenging economic and energy outlook. But we all know that makes no difference to the realities of climate physics. The carbon budget binds, and we really need to get back onto the trajectories that we'd identified, and relatively quickly, despite the current energy crisis. This is a tricky thing for the G20, and obviously finance ministers are meeting this weekend. But there is scope to turn crisis into opportunity, and for them to take more concerted action together to accelerate transition, and catalyze the enormous private investment that's needed to create growth, generate high-paying jobs across the G20 and beyond. My second point is that the G20 doesn't need to act alone, so it can build on a private financial system that is strategically aligning to net zero transition. So at COP26, we agreed that we'd work to put climate at the heart of every financial decision. And GFANZ was founded building on the UN's Race to Zero, which sets the entry criteria for our alliances. And we're working at pace to develop the tools that firms need in our membership and beyond to align their balance sheets with net zero transition. And we've just issued a globally consistent transition planning framework for consultation. I just want to flag that takes a whole of economy approach to transition. So it's not portfolio decarbonisation, it's not divestment. So it looks at financing green solutions, it looks at ramping up financing to the already green. But it also, importantly, and I think for all of us who are cognizant of the need for orderly energy transition, looks at the financing of firms in hard to abate sectors that need to transition, and the managed phase out of high emitting assets. My third point is that we need to then map the carbon budget at the top through to the financing choices that firms are making. We recently issued some guidance on how firms can use that, and we need to do more in that space, and especially in high carbon sector. And then to the point, which many of you have mentioned, is that we think we need to build on all of the good work that you're all doing, and be bold. And we think that the G20 needs to grasp the nettle and build a new financial architecture, with an updated approach to country platforms that will support emerging markets looking to take an ambitious approach to net zero transition. And we'll be issuing later today the sort of GFANZ private sector perspective on this issue to date, to help inform the debate. And what we sort of set out there is that what would work for the private sector, or what our members have identified so far would help crowd in finance, is a number of things. So first, it needs to start with very clear country ownership and ambition, with each country laying out its significant emissions reductions with clear timetables, projects, and so on. But there's also the need to engage with development partners and private investors on that plan, and to sort of collectively agree that yes, this is the plan we're going to finance. A number of major economies, including Indonesia, have embarked on this path already. The second point is that we need financing roadmaps that identify the costs of the transition and how to use scarce resourcing most effectively. We really need to make the most of public finance and not use it in ways that crowd out private finance. We just can't afford that. We need to do upstream de-risking, so there will be some reforms that are needed to energy markets and other key sectors to crowd in finance. And we need to do, as many of you have said, a lot of work to build a pipeline of bankable projects, because they're just not there at sufficient scale at the moment. But also, I just wanted to mention, and this hasn't come up so much directly, we think we need a new approach to the way we use MDB capital. We need to be more ambitious. We need to pool it, blend it, use the resources more flexibly. And that's going to take some fairly significant reform to the regulatory, to the international financial architecture. And there may need to be changes to some aspects of the international financial regulatory architecture to unlock the investment. So I guess my key point is that we really need to mobilize to be ambitious here, building on all of the good work that's been mentioned so far on the panel. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alice, for sharing with us your thoughts in terms of what the private sector is looking for and some potential pathways forward. Now that we've had our first introductory remarks for the panelists, I'd like to thank them for being brief so that we can have a final set of very rapid questions in the time remaining. I'm actually going to start with Alice. Could you, you outlined a lot about what's happening at the sort of top-down vision level with G20 and G7 and the country platforms. But I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more with how we can match that with what is really happening on the ground by developers and investors.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I think, you know, I spoke recently to someone who'd worked in development finance for a long time, and they, you know, and explained the country platform approach. And actually, initially they were a little skeptical because they've been around the same loop of trying to mobilize capital for about 20 years. So the problems I think are well known, and actually every person on this panel has highlighted a pretty similar set of issues that we face. So I think we need to keep going, and we ourselves are doing this with all the initiatives we've all described to experiment with blending finance, pooling finance, developing the pipelines, getting those going, etc., etc. But we really need to take those learnings in a structured way up so that we have a kind of top-down process to them, and we meet in the middle, because otherwise our good efforts bottom up are going to run into various barriers, and we just won't be able to mobilize the capital needed. I think our Indonesian colleagues have mentioned the number, the sum that they need for Indonesian energy transition, and it's quite large. And you know, there's the same situation in many emerging markets, and I just don't think we'll get to that number globally, the number needed, unless we actually kind of marry the top down with the bottom up. And so I think we need to pool our experience and try and build this new architecture. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Alice. Next, I'd like to pose a follow-up question to Dr. Mathur. Could you tell us about how ISA is working with the private sector and what can be done to facilitate access to more affordable capital for financing smaller solar projects? Dr. Mathur, I think you're muted.
There you go. Thanks so much. Cecilia, there are two approaches that I think make sense. The first, as far as the private sector is concerned, all the projects that we work on with our member countries are put out for bidding. And it's the private sector which then comes in and does those projects. So what we're doing is helping create the kinds of policies within our member countries which accelerate the participation of the private sector in the process. The second is financing. So especially as far as the blended finance facility is concerned, it's going to be managed by a private sector fund manager and would be aimed at providing resources to private sector players, particularly the smallest ones. So there's carved aside for the smaller projects, because otherwise the projects that are at the level of individual solar pumps or solar facilities in schools or hospitals never get done. I think these kinds of both the policy interventions on one side and carve-outs on the other side would help us in ensuring that solar becomes the energy source of choice for all kinds of energy applications across the globe.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mathur. Now, Pak Darwin, from Indonesia's experience with the SDG1 and blended finance platform, what recommendations would you give other countries looking to set up a blended finance facility for climate action?
Yeah, thank you, Cecilia. we started our activities as the infrastructure financing company, but then we shift toward to become the development finance institution for Indonesia. We understand from the point of view of the lending, because we are the intermediary, we are non-bank financial, so we truly understand with regards to how to project to be invest or to be financing, because we do the structuring of the financing from the project. So actually, the first thing first that we need to have is actually the understanding about the true transaction structure on the projects levels. And then we move to become the development financial institution. We are closely related on how the policy process is being made. So I think at that point, SMA is putting certain recommendation on how the policy can support to the initiative, to the initiative of how the project should be continuously developed. And very important issues is that if you would like to establish the blended finance platform, as I call it in the SDG Indonesia one, it is important for you also to have a strong mandate from the government. And it can be achieved only if you are becoming the government special mission entity or vehicles, meaning that we can have an access to actually access to the public financing, in which we will then structure in such way and blending with other sources, especially coming from the commercial as well as from the non-government actors support. So I think that's really important. And other hand is as to have this entity, I think this entity should be accountable, transparent, and receiving certain uh, uh, acknowledgement as well as endorsement from the market as well as from the international communities. It is also important to work in collaboration with the other development financial institution, either multilateral or bilateral, or also with the climate fund, because they are setting different standards that probably can help us to form our own standard that probably can then be used to in accessing to the international financing support. That's from me. Thank you, sis.
Thank you very much, Pak Darren. Next, Abhishek, are you still online? Great. So I wanted to ask you a quick follow-up as well. In terms of the funds available through CIF under the ACT Investment Program, I was wondering, are these funds earmarked only for government access, or can you also, as a private developer, also access some of the funds under the CIF facilities? And I also wanted to just clarify whether the 2 billion that was announced by G7 countries to support the CIF Act program, was that in addition to, for example, the money that's being committed towards the JETPs? So here I'm referring, in the case of South Africa, to that 8.5 billion that was announced at COP26.
Thank you, Cecilia. And I'm currently in Joburg in South Africa, where we're experiencing load shedding. So it calls out for the urgent need for action. And if I drop out, so please forgive me for dropping out. It's not planned. To your question, to the first part, I would answer it in two parts. One is a key element of our business model is to mobilize private sector financing. And the way we do it, and this is the second part, is through our MDB partnership model, which is where we work with 6 MDBs, who I mentioned earlier, in order to mobilize action on the ground and in the process leverage private sources, among others, including bilats and others, towards strategic priorities and strategic investment in client countries. So through that model, we tend to mobilize private sector financing using our concessional financing. And we do that in a couple of ways. Our concessional financing sources, which is basically low interest rates, long tenors, they act as risk capital. They alleviate risks. They lower costs of capital, and in the process, they make it more attractive for the private sector to come in. We also, through our financing, support demonstration or proof of concepts of certain activities, where this again helps develop a comfort level for the private sector to come in. I'll offer one example. In the case of geothermal, we have a specific instrument called contingent grant, which is to tackle the resource availability risk of the technology, which essentially, to put it very simply, what it does is if resources are found, this funding could be returned as a lending or a loan instrument, but if they are not, then they are considered as grant. Now, of course, I'm oversimplifying it, and there is a great deal of diligence that goes behind that, but this is just to give you an example of an instrument which has helped scale up geothermal in Latin America and including also in Indonesia. So just an example of how we do that. To your second question around ACT, consistent with the first part, where our investments, our interventions help mobilize private sector capital and private sector engagement, we are following the same process or model for ACT, where the money that will be used, the concessional money that will be deployed for coal phase out, will help attract private sector for, say, for example, activities under repurposing of existing sites with solar plus renewable or batteries, for example. Or under the people's pillar, there is a component around creating alternative income generation opportunities for people and communities. And there again is an opportunity for private sector to come in. So again, just to give you an example of how private sector can engage through ACT, through different tracks or pillars. Last part of your question around ACT and JET partnership. ACT, given the scope of ACT, which is to do with coal phase out, it sits squarely and centrally in the JET partnership, which is to focus on electricity decarbonization and a long-term just transition and energy transition goals of South Africa. So in that, it is a key component of the JET partnership. But of course, the JET partnership includes a host of other actors, including bilateral sources of financing, such as KfW, AFD, and others who are active in the country. Hope this is helpful. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Abhishek. So final question to Pak Luki. I wonder, how can the activities under the G20 finance track, including the work of the Sustainable Finance Working Group and that roadmap, be brought closer together with the work under the energy transition and the climate and sustainability working groups?
Yeah, thank you very much. As I said before, that there are at least under G20, there are two main tracks. The first one, finance track, and also separate tracks. Finance tracks, even under finance track, we have special working group. It's so-called Sustainable Finance Working Group, focusing on how we address this climate change, especially from the financing side. And of course, we have also another working group. It's called Infrastructure Working Group. And now the focus also talking or discussing about how we, going forward, we develop not only just infrastructure, but infrastructure that is resilient, inclusive, and sustainable. So there are, I mean, this concern about this climate change, about this green, about this ESG, about SDG has been kind of kind of cross-cutting, has occurred and in across these different working groups, showing that how serious we are. We have same concern how to address this. So the challenge for all of us, how to orchestrate or how to design this, because here the thing is, it will be good if we can do it together in a more collaborative way, in which we're gonna have much more, effective, optimal result. It's easy to say, but that's what we need, including the concept of blended finance, for example, that again, for Indonesia case, that in the past, almost all of our infrastructure was developed from one source of funding, for example, either coming from, let's say, loan, from the budget, right? Now, hey, it turns out that by having this blended finance, by having, pulling together, blending together those different sources source of funding. So we're talking about kind of risk. We're talking about risk distribution. We're talking about this cost effectiveness, right? And then we also have some concern that we can get, let's say, more competitive rate that people who have concern. I'm talking about green fund philanthropists who have big concern on addressing this climate change. So if we can put it together in the most effective, most efficient way, and of course the result will be it's going to be very productive. So again, the concrete example, I'm talking about this energy transition. Indonesia relies so much on this coal-fired power plant. So yes, we are asked to reduce, right, to retire our coal-fired power plant. But again, this is expensive for us. We have long-term contract. How do we do that, right? So it's going to be costly. So if we can get support from these, people who have some concern, I'm talking about this green fund, I'm talking about this. So if we have to pay, let's say, just commercial rate, so it won't be possible. Because Indonesia is still growing country, we are still developing country. So with that combination, with that kind of working together, so we can design a system in such a way that can achieve our goals. So we retired early, that's okay. But at the same time, hey, we also plan to build this new, more friendly renewable energy power plant, which is again the same thing, a bit more expensive. So if there is no kind of special design on how this system work together, so it's not going to happen. So that's one concrete example. So that's why we are working, we are promoting in terms of this energy transition mechanism that is just yet affordable.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid our time is up for this session, and I'd like to close by thanking our first group of panelists. Thank you very much, Alice, Dr. Matur, Pak Darwin, Abhishek, and Pak Luki, for sharing with us and contributing to this excellent discussion. In the interest of time, I'll save my summary for the closing and pass the floor back to our MC. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecilia, for moderating the first panel discussion. This is such a fruitful discussion, so thank you very much for all the panelists that already shared their opinion and insight about how to close the global climate finance gap. Thank you very much, and give a virtual applause to the moderator and the panelists for the first session of this panel discussion. Well, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, we are moving to the next panel discussion. We already have Ms. Ferania Andrea as the moderator of the second panel discussion. Before that, here's the short biography of Ferania Andrea, who is the Senior Advisor for Sustainable Energy with UNDP Indonesia, with more than 15 years of experience in program development and policy advocacy for energy, climate change, and green economy topics. She holds doctorate degree in biotechnology from the University for Natural and Applied Life Science in Vienna, Austria. So, Ms. Rara, I know her as Ms. Rara. The time for the panel discussion is for about 30 minutes, so I will give the floor to Ms. Rara. Ms. Rara, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. So it has been an interesting discussion on the first session, and I'm pleased to have to become your moderator for this session too. of this discussion on energy and climate financing. The topic for the session 2 will be the building bankable project pipelines at scale. So we have been talking about the financing, but what happens if there is no bankable project pipelines? So in this session, I'm pleased to introduce three of our distinguished speakers. First is Miss Sinta Rusli, and the second one is Miss Anne Petrarcui, and the third one is Mr. Daniel Hanna. So without further ado, I would like to invite Miss Sinta Rusli. She is a Director of Finance and Risk Management at the Indonesia National Utility Company, or PLN. She is a well-acknowledged professional in financing sector in Indonesia. Ibu Cynthia, time is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Bu Ferania. Good morning. Thank you, Bu Ferania. Very good afternoon, everyone. Very good morning for those of you who's on different timeline. So, as asked by the organizer that PLN should present the case of how to build a bankable project. So, may I explain a bit about the context of what we have been doing for the last few years and how can we actually showcase some of the projects that we have been financed by the multilateral, bilateral, and some other commercial banks, and how are we going to be able to push forward for managing the energy transitions. So with this opportunity, allow me to discuss about two topics. Next, please. Next, please. Yeah, next. Yeah. So first is the building bankable project pipeline, and second is the financial solutions for different capital providers. Next. Yeah, next. Yeah, so just to give everyone a context that you have been also aware of the carbon neutral program that we have by 2060, and along with the net zero carbon roadmap that we have been already announced, we also have a certain challenge with the development of infrastructure. We have identified that for the development of power plants, transmission and distributions, and some other need infrastructure for Indonesia power sector, annually PLN would need about 72 trillion of investment. This is in accordance with our current RUPTL 2021-2030. So with those huge amount of investment required to develop the infrastructure to meet the Indonesia electricity demand, we need to basically unlock four areas. One is the price of the electricity for the customers, as this also relates to the subsidies and compensation from the government. And second is on the financing itself, because we need large scale capital outlay that can be up to 500 billion US dollars cumulative for the next 10 years down the road. So at least we need for up to 5 billion US dollars in immediate funding support for the few years down the road. So this is very important. I think today we are going to discuss on this financing aspect and how can we see the opportunity to access to the lower cost green financing. And the other one is, of course, the technology. So we understand that currently we have quite an early stage of technology development, and we are going to also push forward with the hydrogen and implementations of the carbon capture and storage, and how can we deploy this at large scale in Indonesia. And the last one is really, of course, the policy and regulatory. The policy support for not only on the tariff, on the price to the customers, the policy support with regard to the subsidies, the policy support with regard to the adoption of the technology, the fiscal incentives, and including also the push to increase or to support and drive the adoptions of the electric vehicles in Indonesia. So this is basically the context on how big is the financing need for the power sector related investment which is required by the country. And with this, we require a few support. Of course, the soft loan is a key for us to accelerate the executions of the decarbonization projects. And with regard to the project preparations and to the ability to develop project bankable pipeline, we of course need certain technical assistance to have a certain standard, appropriate project standards, which of course require or meet the eligibility for green financing. So that's basically the context that we are facing now. And we can tell everyone that PLN have started to develop a few framework, for the last few years. Next, please. So we have been doing this, at least for the from corporate perspective and the project perspective. Let us see on the corporate level first. Next. So this is basically highlighted some of the green initiatives from PLN. So this is basically various agenda that have been already executed in order to support our decarbonization agenda. One is the issuance of the statement of intent of the sustainable financing framework. So by November 2020, we have basically produced this sustainable financing framework, basically to provide the baseline for us to access for the green financing. And later, in that year as well, the December 2020, we have successfully issued our first green loan worth $500 million with the guarantee from the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, MIGA, with in support for the financing from 9 different international commercial banks. On the 3 points, we also signed a loan, $600 million on May 2022 with ADB, of course, with the support from the government of Indonesia, the Ministry of Finance, $600 million for sustainable and reliable energy access program. So this is actually will be used for transmission reinforcement project, clean energy projects, and also improving corporate financing management. Number 4, we have already finished our green finance framework. So first we have this sustainable financing framework, and then we also issue our green financing framework later last year. And basically, we can share to everyone here that we have basically concluded our external review or second party opinion from a well-known institution. So I think ADB have already provided us with a great support and assistance in pushing and preparing ourselves, our project, to be able to get the access on for the green financing from the market. And number 5, basically, based on our initiative in number 4, we actually have already in the mode of ready for green bond issuance or other ESG related bonds. But we, of course, knowing for the last year the volatility in the market, so we postponed the plan for the issuance, and we still wait for the market to be conducive and adjust with our liquidity needs with the market conditions. But basically, we can tell that PLN has been ready for any green bond, instruments for issuance. And the last one, I think we are now working, push ourselves to also increase and widespread to the corporate wide, PLN wide, the ESG framework and ESG linked financings to strengthen our commitment to ESG, and also expanding our sources of funding from ESG concern investment and lenders. So basically, to conclude this slide, that for the last 2 years, we are fully aware that this is the thing that we need to develop. We need to develop the framework. We need to ensure that the project that we are preparing is going to be bankable, not only bankable for ordinary conventional banks or financiers, but also it's going to be bankable for a green financing. Next.
Excuse me, Ibu Cynthia, apologize because of the very limited time. Appreciate if you can deliver your key message in 1 minute, Bu. Thank you.
All right, okay. So let's go quickly. So this is things that we do. Just the more explanation to this. Next, please. Number 1, number 2. So this is the project that we, the green loan that we have. Number 3. Next, please. So this is the loan, and we have also signed with ADB and guaranteed by the government and Indonesia Infrastructure Guarantee Fund for the clean energy projects. Next. Yes, this is the green financing framework for managing the use of proceeds, project evaluation and selection, management of process and reporting. Next. Then this is of course the considerations and the corridor for us to use the proceeds. Next. So I think in the project level, I just show what are the things that we have been doing on the project level. Just a snapshot of this list of the project for various banks. Next, please. So we basically how we improve the project bankability from the guarantee as an instrument and the source of financiers and stakeholders since 2015 to 2022. Next. And also the technical assistance from various stakeholders, multilateral as well as the bilateral. Next. And also the framework that on the ESG to improve the project bankability. And next, please. So I think the last part, okay, just go through. Yeah, so this is the case study also, the financing instruments from various capital providers. Each of them are multilateral, bilateral, export credit agency, and all the things. So go through just a few slides more. Next, please. Yes, same. Next. And the projects have a various, type of project pipeline that we have been doing. So I think that's all for sharing today. Looking forward for more discussion on this. Thank you very much. Sorry about the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ibu Cynthia, for the intervention. I think it's interesting to see how PLN build up the project pipelines to meet different requirements in order to be bankable. For the second speaker, I would like to invite Ms. Anne Petarquit. She is the head of finance and insurance at the Enel Green Power and Thermal Generation. She leads the international team of finance professionals to support the Enel's growth ambition in renewables. Ms. Anne, the floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So first of all, I wanted to thank the Indonesian G20 presidency and the OECD for the invitation to this panel and for giving me the opportunity to talk about the energy and climate financing. So you asked me to describe what is needed to develop a large pipeline of bankable projects in emerging and developing countries from a global utility perspective like Enel's one. Well, there is not a single solution to de-risk investment in renewable globally and to attract private capitals from both investors and commercial lenders. But from the private sector perspective, There are, however, some prerequisites which are fundamental to create market conditions and to open to commercially attractive opportunities for renewable energy projects. More and more investors are willing to deploy large amounts of capital in the energy sector, and in particular in the renewable energies. The lack of capital is not today the first break on the energy transition in emerging and developing countries, but we see several causes explaining the limited private interest in some countries. And the main are the political instability, weaker macroeconomic fundamentals, limited national energy transition ambitions, and the lack of, this is an important one, the lack of adequate policy and regulatory framework. So what I want to talk to you about today is one of the most successful de-risking programs that we have seen in the recent past, and that has been the long-term bankable offtake model adopted by India with the reverse auction system, which has greatly contributed to the construction of more than 40 gigawatts of new renewable capacity in the last 4 years, and one of the key drivers for attracting foreign investment, especially on the debt side, which constitute between 70 and 85% of renewable project cost funding. Indeed, India set up the Solar Energy Corporation of India in 2011, a central government agency which has played a key role in enabling India energy transition by formulating a strong national policy and legal framework. Since 2018, SECI has been the main agency conducting and implementing the auction in India. The SECI de-risking model works in the following way. SECI conducts auctions and signs power purchase agreement with renewable energy producers, underlying the guaranteed offtake of the projects. SECI, in turn, signs power sale agreement with the state distribution company who are the beneficiaries of the power purchased on a back-to-back basis. The key bankability enhancer of this model has been: 1, SECI underwrite the PPAs and leverage on the strong credit rating of India's central government, giving sufficient comfort to the debt providers on off-taker credit profiles, and helps lower the cost of energy, which benefits to the state distribution companies. The SECI PPAs provide standard terms for ease of decision-making to debt providers by covering the main risk like energy evacuation, payment security, termination payment, and force majeure. The payment security mechanism to de-risk investment in renewable have been put in place by way of a central budgetary allocation to create funds which backstop payment security under SECI PPA, and the tripartite agreement between center, state, and SECI, which allows SECI to call upon the budget allocated to the state by central government in case the state discom default. And fourth, being a nodal agency for promoting the renewable capacity in the country, SECI is able to plan and execute integrated programs, providing one-stop solution for debt providers and IPP, giving policy stability by central government instead of dealing with multiple complex state governments. Such a de-risking model implemented by the government of India has not only enabled the country to accelerate its energy transition by installing more than 40 gigawatts of capacity in 4 years, but it has also enabled the country to reach one of the most competitive renewable tariffs in the world. I must say, however, that a similar kind of de-risking model is not sufficient in other developing countries where risk perceived from investors goes beyond the lack of an adequate and supporting regulatory framework and includes other risk factors known as political risk. For long-term capital-intensive renewable investors, the most critical risk that have to be covered regards the breach of contract and includes the fulfillment of short-term and long-term payment obligation, currency convertibility, and cash repatriation. In these developing countries, fit-for-purpose de-risking instruments coupled with capacity building policy will be crucial to pave the way for energy transformation. And this can be achieved, in our opinion, only by a systematic and joint multilateral effort. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Anna, for sharing the experience of Anna. I think it is important, take very well noted that you mentioned that the adequate regulatory and policy of a country. That's also an important requirement for the good project and attract the private investment as well. Thank you so much. I would like to invite our third speakers, Mr. Daniel Hanna. He is a global head of sustainable finance, Standard Chartered Bank. He's also responsible for Standard Chartered's environmental and social risk management team and developed Standard Chartered 2050 net zero commitment. Mr. Daniel, time is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the organisers for the invitation to this very important and prestigious panel, and to the Indonesian Committee in general for the excellent work that they're doing around the G20. We've heard a lot today around transition. I'm going to try and say a few words about adaptation and how we can really accelerate the growth of adaptation finance. But before I do that, let me just set a little bit of context. Standard Chartered is one of the world's leading banks focused around Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. We have made commitments to be net zero in our operations by 2025 and net zero in the impact of our financing by 2050. We have further committed $300 billion to green and transition finance by 2030. And indeed, last year, we financed over $23 billion in green and transition finance. And actually 70% of that was focused on low-income countries. We're also currently the chair of the Net Zero Banking Alliance, the chair of the Equator Principles, and we're very active within the GFANZ workstream on mobilization of financing to emerging markets. Just a couple of examples of transactions that we've done on the transition side since we've talked about it, and it was a pleasure to hear the government of Indonesia talking about their recent very successful green sukuk Islamic bond. It was actually the largest green sukuk globally, $1.5 billion green tranche, which we were a JLM for. We've also been very honoured to be involved in the financing of Southeast Asia's largest floating solar project in Indonesia, which was a 145 megawatt project. But I really wanted to just focus my quick remarks on adaptation in particular, since we've heard so much excellent comments around sort of transition financing. And this really comes in two parts. One, it is about when we finance projects, really requiring those projects to go through a very rigorous climate change risk assessment, and in particular, really stressing the potential acute physical climate risks, which we are now obviously seeing increasingly in terms of severity and frequency, whether that is in terms of the impact from droughts, storms, floods, heat waves, and wildfires. And there's a couple of recent transactions and financings that we've done where we've really applied this to build in more resiliency into the project, and both in terms of railways. We did a $1.6 billion financing for a single gauge railway in East Africa. It's will be East Africa's largest single gauge railway, and has not only taken a significant number of trucks off the road, thereby reducing emissions, but it's also reduced costs and created 8,000 local jobs. We've also financed recently a 1.2 billion ECA-backed electrified railway in Turkey of 200 kilometers in diameter. And so really when we're working through these projects, we're now increasingly focused and spending a lot of time in terms of making sure that there is climate resiliency in these projects going forward. In terms of the climate adaptation, though, I really wanted to talk about a couple of examples. One was a $1.1 billion clean water facility that we financed in southern Africa, which provided 2 million people access to clean water for the first time. And that was a partnership across ATI, BPI, and the World Bank. And the other one is a 96 million euro facility supported by UK Export Finance, which was around the development and installation of off-grid solar water pumping stations for water-stressed communities. And this really helps not only support communities that are increasingly suffering from heat waves and lack of access to clean water, but also in terms of preventing further exploitation of water resources in the region, whether that's swamps or other water habitats. So very active in terms of these types of projects. Three quick sort of points I'd like to draw attention to in terms of this discussion. I think the first one is we really do need to lift our ambition as a whole in this space. Standard Chartered put out a piece of research earlier this year that estimates to help emerging markets reach net zero by 2060, not by 2050, but 2060, there is currently a financing gap of $94.8 trillion. And indeed, if we expect the emerging markets to fund that themselves, that will make emerging markets significantly worse off. However, if the developed markets support that financing, not only do emerging markets living standards rise, but actually also the developed markets standards rise as well. So I think we really do need to focus around the mobilization of private finance into middle and particularly low-income countries. And I know that the OECD has set out a sort of target potentially of 100 billion by 2024. I think we really need to look at how we can do a lot more of this. As I mentioned earlier, Standard Chartered has 70% of its sustainable finance focused on low-income countries, and we know how hard this is, which is precisely why I think it's really important that we collectively focus on how we do this. I think to echo some comments from other panelists as well, we really do believe that blended finance can play a key role here. Standard Chartered has done more than $15 billion of blended finance in recent years. And I think although the recent average globally has been about 9 billion a year over the last 5 years, we really need to grow this exponentially. And I really welcome the comments from earlier panelists about closer coordination across the sort of development finance community, whether it's the MDBs, the multilateral banks, or the development finance institutions. But also I would extend that into export credit agencies and philanthropic pieces. How we work, and to pick up on Alice Carr's comments earlier, how we work around these financing roadmaps and ensuring that very precious ODA financing is really focused just where nothing else can finance it, or catalyzing the private sector to come into other areas is really key. One of our recommendations is to look at expanding a piece of regulation that the European Union put in place in response to the COVID pandemic called CRR2 501A, which provides a bit of capital relief for financing that is green and focused on public essential services. We would suggest expanding this further into areas of blended finance to really provide that structural incentive to go. I think so really need to, second point, really exponentially grow blended finance. Third point is, and I think colleagues right now just mentioned this, is about reducing barriers to private investment more broadly. To obviously increase the number of the pipeline of bankable projects. I think we will sort of talk about that. Here, policy certainty, commitment to new technologies are absolutely key, but also allowing access to the private sector in this space in the first place. In Africa, to date, there are 16 countries that do not provide private sector access into electricity generation directly, and there are 25, that don't provide it in terms of distribution. Giving the private sector access to this will provide new sources of financing and can offload the risk to the private sector, as well as bring in technology and expertise. I think on a country by country basis, we also need to look at tackling specific regulations that may be holding this up. And this may be, for example, the PPA frameworks or the PPP frameworks, the public-private partnership frameworks, and really looking at how we can do that. And then finally, we're also working with other banks, including HSBC, on developing a fast infrastructure label, which would be able to be applied to all critical infrastructure that has this kind of climate and sustainable focus. And we hope that that will help support the growth of sustainable infrastructure as an asset class, as we have seen the success of green finance and green bonds being growth as that has established itself. We could hopefully see that and comparisons across multiple different countries, which would hopefully lead to further financing in the space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I think I'm afraid that we don't have time to continue question and answer about this interesting session. So I think the key note that I take is that the message to the G20 countries from the speakers of the session 2 is blended finance is one of the potential strong instrument that can be supporting the bankability of the project pipelines, not only in climate mitigation, but also in climate adaptation. With that, I thank so much for our distinguished speakers. And thank you. I will return to MC. Good afternoon.
Yes, thank you very much, Ms. Rara, for leading this second session of panel discussion. And thank you very much for all the panelists. Let's give up the virtual applause for the moderator and the panelists for the second session of this panel discussion. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, we are now heading towards the last agenda of the webinar. Before closing, I would like to invite first Ms. Cecilia Tam to deliver the wrap-up for today's webinar. Ms. Cecilia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alfie. And in the interest of time, I'll try to keep my remarks brief, but just to highlight a few of the key takeaways that I've noted from our discussion and the excellent remarks from our speakers over these last two sessions. First, I would start with the importance of country ownership and leadership in setting investment plans for net zero transitions. This will need to be accompanied by strong regulatory and enabling frameworks that can allow private investors to develop and finance projects that are going to be necessary for the transition. Thirdly, many of our speakers noted the need to use limited public funds, particularly funding from MDBs, in a more efficient and effective way so that it can leverage much larger amounts of private capital to really meet the trillions in investments that we'll need to achieve a net zero transition. This includes ensuring that that limited public funding is really only going to where either it can leverage much larger amounts of private capital, or where for a variety of different reasons, including different risks, no other sources of capital are really going in that area. Fourth, we heard across a number of our speakers about the important role that blended finance will play and the potential for this particular instrument to help support the development of bankable project pipelines for both climate adaptation and mitigation. And then finally, the need for new partnership models that can really help to enhance collaboration across different sectors, across different stakeholders, and create the right types of collaboration and partnership opportunities to help de-risk investments and lower the cost of finance. With that very short summary, I'd like to thank all of our speakers and participants and the government of Indonesia for partnering with us on this very important final session on energy and climate finance. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Cecilia.
Thank you, Cecilia Tam, for a very comprehensive wrap-up. And now it's time for me to kindly invite Honorable Ms. Laksmi Dewanti, Director General of Climate Change, Ministry of Environment and Forestry, as the Chair of CSWG to deliver the closing remark. Ms. Dewanti, the floor is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. May Allah bless upon you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Distinguished colleagues, Chair of Energy Transition Working Group, Mr. Yudo Dwinanda Priyadi, my colleagues, Director General of New and Renewable Energy, Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources Indonesia, Mr. Dadan Kusdiana, Acting Environment Director, OECD, Mr. Alain Desares, Chief Energy Economist of International Energy Agency, Mr. Tim Cook, participants from G20 countries and other countries, particularly Energy Transition Working Group and Climate Sustainability Working Group delegates, from governments, business sector, financial institutions, and other stakeholders of climate and energy. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to congratulate Energy Transition Working Group and OECD that have convened this event, which I believe has resulted productive and positive insight and inputs to current discussion in Climate Sustainability Working Group and Energy Transition Working Group. As you may aware, these two working groups have many in common and interlinked issues. The chair of this working group always in close coordination in order to ensure no duplications processes. Energy sector accounts for the most predominant greenhouse gas emissions globally and the second largest emitters in Indonesia. Countries have agreed in Glasgow last year to increase their ambition of NDC's target, including through energy transition toward low greenhouse gas energy system, phasing down of coal as main primary energy supply in power plants in many countries, including Indonesia, requires substitutions to new and renewable energy and some alternative to the use of CCS, CCUS in the short and medium time frame of the process. In order to allow this effort are aligned with Paris Agreement target, the availability of finance is inevitably important to develop enabling environment, develop and deployment of cleaner technology. All financial, public, private, domestic, and international resources need to mobilize to overcome the adaptations and clean energy financing gap. Lesson learned in developing project pipelines that can attract financing at the scale needed to support a full-scale transition should be shared across countries. Distinguished speakers, colleagues, participants, ladies and gentlemen, there are some points to develop robust and enabling environment that I would like to highlight. A robust understanding of the market failures, barriers, and risks to mitigation and cleaner energy system at the national levels is a prerequisite to designing effective financing solution. Second, private sector partners, both project developers and commercial finance providers, need to be involved since the beginning of design level and to implementation of solutions. Third, public sources of finance need to shift from direct concessional finance of clean energy projects to focus on de-risking that can crowd in much higher multiples of commercial finance. The development of innovative financial instrument by Ministry of Finance Republik Indonesia and green taxonomy established by Indonesian Financial Service Authority could encourage effective ways to catalyze commercial finance and proactive financial sector. Reform in the wider financial ecosystem are therefore needed to support private capital mobilization. The last one, closer coordinations among energy, finance track, and related working group of G20, such as climate and development infrastructure, would support financing a just energy transition. Distinguished speakers, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, finally, I would like to take the opportunity to thank you for your valuable participations and input in this event that could contribute and enrich the process of Climate Sustainability Working Group and Energy Transition Working Group. In addition, my highest appreciations to the OECD that has initiated this event together with Climate Sustainability Working Group and Energy Transition Working Group. I thank you and I hope what we are doing today are our concrete contribution to recover together, recover stronger. Thank you. Have a wonderful day. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lakmi, for giving the closing remarks. And now, distinguished participants, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, today is a very good day. This is the 13th webinar held in 13th of July, but this is the day when we have to change and act now toward a positive outcome of the energy transition. And now, as we have reached the end of the webinar series entitled Energy and Climate Financing, on behalf of the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, OECD, as well as the Ministry of Forestry, I would like to extend my highest appreciation and gratitude for your participation and collaboration for the successful of this webinar today. Stay safe, healthy, and happy. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Yeah.